I'm Christine Merle with the Social Emotional Learning Center, and this is Part B of our Self-Management module. This part of our module is going to be focused on strategies for self-management, and we've put all of them into 3 categories for today. So we're going to be looking at foundational skills that we develop with our students. We're looking at teaching perseverance, and then again our coping skills for how to handle things when it doesn't necessarily go our way. So we're going to jump in first with our foundational skills, and I'm going to ask your facilitator to kind of guide you through a little bit of an activity that I'm going to call our connections activity. You're going to break into small groups, and your facilitator will give you a scenario to contemplate. And although I know we are all honest, kind, compassionate people, have a really honest, quiet discussion about what you would do in each of these scenarios. Report out, and we'll come back to talk about it as a whole. Thank you for participating in that activity. And I really want you to think about some of the discussions you may have heard. I know we would all give back that $10. However, when I go into that big store, if it's snowing, if I made it to my car, if I had my kids with me, I might stop and think a little bit about that $10. As opposed to that mom and pop scenario. There's a bakery down the street from me, and I stop in once a week to buy that loaf of bread for my parents. So I have a relationship with the owner. I don't know her name, she doesn't know my name, but I know that if I made it out to my car with the $10, even if it was snowing, and where I live that's very common, chances are I would walk back into that store to give her that $10. We have a relationship of sorts. She knows me. She knows my kids. She knows what kind of cookies they want. And I wouldn't want to disappoint her in that relationship. In the same way, I'm going to ask you how that would look in a cafeteria situation. So those of you who have been blessed with the opportunity to be cafeteria monitor for a day or longer, you know that the minute you step into that role, you lose whatever credentials you have and you have become the lunch lady for the day. Not that that's a bad thing to be. The problem is that I don't have a relationship with so many of the students in that cafeteria. So when I go up to that young man or woman and say, "Can you pick that off the floor for me?" the attitude that I very frequently get is, "That's not mine," and they don't want to pick it up. However, if I go over to one of the students that I know I will be seeing later that day, who I do have a relationship with, I may still get an eye roll and a stomp to the garbage can, but they'll usually pick it up for me. We have some form of relationship, in the same way that I have a relationship with the baker at the end of my street. That relates to William Glasser's work, which is the choice theory. And William Glasser said that for students, much like when we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when we look at students, there are certain things that they need met before they can accomplish other things in your classroom. Those are a sense of belonging, a sense of power, and a sense of freedom especially. Now, we've also included a sense of fun, because learning really should be fun, and unfortunately, so frequently, our rigorous demands take away part of that. So I want us to put it back in and really think about it in social emotional context as well. What I'm going to ask you to do is really think about what these look like in a classroom. So for me, for example, when I look at belonging, it is greeting every student by name every day. And yes, I'm secondary, and yes, I know it's hard, especially when I have equipment to set up, but I stand at the door every day and I greet every student by name. That lets them feel that sense of belonging. In the same way, when I first started teaching years ago and had very little money, I would write everybody's name on the color of their class and tape them to the walls. And it amazed me in January when the tape started to dry off and the names fell off, how many students came to me and said, "My name's not up there." And I think, you're 17 years old. How do you even notice that? But to them, it showed them that they had that sense of belonging in Merle Kingdom in my class. The second one is that idea of power in a classroom and how much power we give students in helping us create our expectations or rules, as we may call them, in a classroom. Now, I am perfectly okay with some things being non-negotiable, and in Merle Kingdom, where I live and my students live, certain things are non-negotiable. For example, the term "shut up" is never used in my classroom. It's a non-negotiable. But there are some things that I allow my students to create for themselves. So even though I may have 1 or 2 non-negotiable expectations or rules, I do allow them to create 2 or 3. And I find that because they've helped create some of those expectations, they are more likely to withhold and stand up to those expectations and really live them to their fullest. Our third one is freedom, and I am a big believer in giving students choices, as much as I possibly can. So I know there is curriculum that I have to deliver, but there's always some choices in the way in which I deliver it, the way in which they receive it, the ways in which they process it, and even the order in which students do things. So I'd like to build in as many authentic choices as I possibly can for my students. The last one to think about is that idea of fun. Have you lost some of that fun in your classroom? When kids start kindergarten, they're so excited, and somehow we lose some of that excitement with every year of school as it becomes more difficult. So I purposely build in some moments for fun. For example, Beat the Clock is an activity that I use with my students secondary, but could very well be modified to use in an elementary classroom as well. It allows them to read, comprehend, follow directions, quiet, exciting, energizer, little bit of activity. You can use it as a competition amongst different classes, or even in one class just to try to beat their own time. And it is available as a resource on our website at children'sinstitute.net. Under resources on the SEL page if you're interested in looking at it, and feel free to modify it for whatever use makes sense to you. Those are things that I would put in that fun category and those energizers that keep my kids on task and going with me for a period of time. So what I'm going to ask you to do is use the template that we've given you and try to come up with a list of the things that you do that fit into each of these categories. What do you do that allow kids to feel that sense of belonging, power, freedom, or fun? And then I'm going to encourage your facilitator to come up with a way for you to share those answers with each other. As educators, you know probably the most important thing we do is steal from each other at all costs, because we don't have enough funds to buy everything. So take some of your ideas from your colleagues and adapt them for use in your own room. Take a few minutes to complete this activity and we'll talk then. I hope you got some great ideas from that activity. I have to say that every time we run that activity, there are one or two ideas that I take to modify for use in my own room, whether it be a birthday board or a new game or a new challenge to try with my students. So I hope you got some great ideas that you can use. We also want to think about the other foundational skills that we're looking at in classrooms in terms of self-management. And I really want you to think about student-focused procedures. So how many of your procedures are really you telling kids how you want things done and them following because of compliance? And how many of them are student-focused so that they can get their own materials, monitor their own behavior, figure out what they need and advocate for themselves, or just access it themselves if they need to? Really take a look at your procedures, which I believe are that cornerstone of keeping kids going and moving, but really think, is there too much of a focus on what I'm setting them up for, or am I allowing the students to have ownership of some of that for themselves? I want you to think a little bit about logical consequences. So let's assume that you're going on a plane trip tomorrow, and you need to be at the airport by 6 a.m. in order to hitch your flight. And unfortunately, you arrive at 6:10. The gate is closed, the plane is just taxiing down the runway, and you sit down in that chair, that warm, comfortable chair that you get in an airport, and you're dejected because you missed your flight. Now, what would happen if that airline ticket person came over and began to yell at you on top of it? The consequence for being late to your plane was you missed your flight. Adding that insult to injury by being yelled at on top of it really isn't going to do much to change your behavior. What really changes your behavior on making it to the airport earlier is the fact that you missed your flight. Next time you're going to set your clock a little earlier. So I'm going to ask you to really think about the consequences that you use in your room. Are they meant to actually change behavior or to just gain quick compliance? Do they make you feel better, or do they actually teach students what the proper behavior should be or would be in any situation? The last thing I'm going to ask you to think about is the idea of teaching versus telling. If you were to go back with me to the first day of sophomore year, and I realize that for some of us it's a longer journey than others, but when you go to that first day of school sophomore years, walk with me. You go to homeroom, you go to first period, and what does the teacher tell you? Here's all the rules for my class. Ding, 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 ding. Then you go to second period. Here's all the rules for my class. You know, Charlie Brown's teacher, wah, 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 and you hear it. And you hear it in third period, and you hear it in fourth period. And at some point, you begin to glaze over, and you're not even hearing what those expectations are anymore. You and I both know as educators, there is a huge difference between teaching kids the rules and telling kids the rules. So if one of my non-negotiable expectations is that students will be on time for my class, I actually teach them what it looks like to be on time. Where do they have to be? What do they have to have with them? And what happens if they're not? What are those logical consequences that come from that? That process of teaching versus telling is one of those best practices that the longer we're in education, we tend to forget about it. And we think, I just want to get through what my expectations are. But that can make a critical difference in actually showing kids why we want certain behaviors from them. So one of the foundational skills that I'm going to ask you to think about then is that idea of reinforcement and the types of reinforcement that we actually use to change behavior. So you are going to be given 4 teacher strategies to sort. Your facilitator will give them to you. What I'm asking you to do is put them in order from the one that you think is most likely to be internalized by a student, one that the student's going to carry with them, all the way to the other end, the one that's going to have the least internal impact on a student. Okay? So put them in the order of the one most likely to be internalized to least likely to be internalized. Talk about it with your group, and then we'll go through your answers. Thank you for doing that activity. I hope you had some conversation about the purpose of reinforcement. True positive reinforcement is to get students to repeat a behavior. Unfortunately, sometimes we can get them to repeat poor behaviors as well as good behaviors. But the goal of this activity was to look at getting good behaviors to repeat themselves. And what we should have found was this order. So we are actually looking at the one most likely to get our students to actually repeat the behavior and become internalized, as well as an intrinsic motivator in the future, is that idea of personal praise. It helps them build their self-confidence so that they will do it for themselves in the future and not just for you in that personal praise. From there, we go to those symbolic activities like student of the month, student of the week, special person for the day. From there, we look at activities, so extra computer time, ability to wear headsets, use of the computer. And lastly, we look at those tangibles, so that stick of gum, that piece of candy. It makes me think about a visit I once took to the zoo. I got to go behind the scenes and work with the animal trainer, and she actually works with the elephants in our local zoo. She said she had started her career with the sea lions, but that the sea lions were such a tangibly based animal that as long as you had a bucket of fish, they would do the tricks for anyone. She moved up to elephants because she felt like with elephants, she actually developed a relationship and they responded to praise and personal touch. And that was the kind of relationship she wanted to have as she was training and changing behavior. And it really made me think about students in my own classroom. When I'm looking at really difficult behaviors or really difficult, challenging students, sometimes I use those tangibles to get us started. So here's the piece of gum to get you in the room on time. But eventually, once we've developed a relationship and we've developed trust, I try to work my way up until we're at that personal praise. Personal praise given without that relationship is seen as disingenuous. Kids don't believe it, and you don't really mean it. You don't know them well enough to give that personal praise at that moment. So sometimes we may start out at that tangible side and move our way to that personal praise. Those are really our foundational skills. The next piece of strategy making that we want to think about for self-management has to do with that goal setting. I'm really going to ask you to think about goal setting, not just in terms of academics. And I know I have many educators who ask kids to set number of sentences, number of problems on their homework, number of minutes working. Those are academic goals, and they're great. They teach kids the skill of setting goals and what it should look like. But I'm going to ask you to take it a step further and really think about things like behavioral goals. So are there some behavioral goals for your students that they could be setting? Think back to that 5-corner activity we did in the first module and the different types of learners we have. Do we have some students that should be taking risks and setting goals towards that? Do we have some students who should be learning how to make decisions and setting goals towards that? And do we have some that just need some impulse control behavior setting goals? And that's fine as well. But are we teaching them that goal setting is not only about the grade that you're going to get, but the behaviors that you're going to use in order to get to where you want to be? The last thing I'm going to ask you to think about in terms of goal setting is the idea of self-reflection and self-assessment. So I worked with a district once where a teacher asked his students to rate themselves at the end of every class, and they could get a potential 3 points based on behavior and effort in his class. and then he would rate them as well. It was so interesting to see at the beginning of the year how many students gave themselves a 3 while he was giving them a 1. As the year went on, it was interesting to see how the students changed their ratings from a 3 to a 2 to a 1, even in some cases, because he was teaching them how to accurately self-assess themselves. And it was interesting to see they would be harder on themselves, where he was actually starting to give them 2s and 3s and trying to marry the two. His goal setting actually helped teach them how to accurately self-assess for themselves and reflect on their strengths and their weaknesses and where they wanted to go. It was wonderful to see the two actually marry and align by the end of the year. So let's move into our second area, which is that having to do with perseverance. Now, at this moment, we're not really going to talk about resilience and recovering from trauma and all of those things, but we're going to look at day-to-day perseverance of our students, their ability to work through challenges, to struggle through, get rid of that term learned helplessness that so many of us are bantering about at this point. In order to do this, I really want you to start with looking at this video, and I know many of you have seen very different variations of the marshmallow test, so we're going to take a little look at this video, and then you can talk about it with your facilitator for a few minutes if you would like, and we'll jump back in talking about perseverance. I hope you enjoyed that version of the marshmallow test. I have to tell you, there have been a few studies now, and we'll actually look at one in further modules that talks about debunking the marshmallow test and the idea of affluence impacting marshmallow test, as well as things like students raised in poverty or trauma not necessarily performing in the same way, because to many of our students that bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. So if you're going to give me a marshmallow now, I don't necessarily believe you're going to give me 2 later. So there are many theories behind whether or not it's true. But I do want you to ask about how many of our students actually have to delay gratification. When we think about our students today, how many of them want something and get it instantly? And does that impact our ability to actually teach them to struggle through difficult material? So even though the marshmallow test may be debunked in some methods, I have to say I have many students that are so used to, what's the answer? Let me look it up. And I myself have been guilty of it. In the car, what was the actress's name? Let me look it up. Where in the old days, we would have to wait a day or two till it came to us in memory. Nowadays, everything is so quickly at our fingertips that we've lost some of that ability to delay gratification as well. When we look at the work that Carol Dweck did on growth versus fixed mindset, and those students that were told at the beginning, you're such a smarty pants, that they lose that ability to actually struggle through tasks. Those with that growth mindset that were told, you worked so hard, you persevered, that they learn, oh, if I work hard enough, I can tackle anything. And that all leads into Vygotsky's work in zone of proximal development. The only people learning are the people that are struggling. If they already know it, then they're not going to struggle at all. It's very easy for them. Everybody should be struggling a little bit. It also impacts some of the work Dr. Martin Seligman did in the areas of optimism and those ideas of permanence, pervasiveness, and personalization. All of these factors kind of impact our students' idea to struggle through challenges. But I have to ask you, those of you who were above a certain age, when we used to play video games, if the character died, you had to go way back to the beginning and start again, hitting those mushrooms and jumping through. Nowadays, our students, when they play video games, you die, you spawn exactly where you left off. So even in video games, we're not encouraging our students to go back to the beginning, frustrate your way all the way through. So let's talk strategies for perseverance then. What are some of the things that I can do to encourage perseverance on a small scale with my students? Again, we're not talking resilience and children coming back from trauma, but just small ways to get my students to understand that frustration is a necessary part of learning. Let's look at things like taking a poll of our students and asking them, how many of you have actually ever had to set a goal and either earn money or do certain things to get to that goal? And how long did it take? It'd be interesting to see how many of your students actually have set those goals and worked very hard towards them. Let's look at the idea of struggle time. I have one writing teacher who sets a time limit for her students. In October, the time limit is 2 minutes. They must write continuously for 2 minutes. Free write whatever you want. And as the year progresses, she increases that amount of time. She sets clear expectations for the students that they must continue to write whatever it is, and sometimes it's, I hate this, I hate the teacher. But eventually she got her class up to the point where they were writing for 18 minutes by spring. And from those 18 minutes then they could take good pieces of information to turn into papers and research projects and journal entries. We want to look at things like games and puzzles in our classroom because there is still a place for games and puzzles, even at the secondary level. So in my classroom, I had things like Labyrinth with the board where you have to use the little knobs in order to keep the marble in place. Nowadays, they have Perplexus, the big round balls that you try to keep the ball in maze. I have things like a deck of cards, not solitaire on a computer because you win too frequently on the computer, but a deck of cards where students actually learn how to play solitaire the old-fashioned way. I have things like puzzles, because puzzles really teach that idea of frustration and perseverance, and it should fit, but it doesn't fit. I often use things like video clips, and there are certain websites where you can get great clips on people that have struggled through adversity. Some of them may seem, well, that's not me, that's so far out there, but it at least starts the conversation in my classroom of what it would look like for you to persevere through some of your challenges. I often use the website wingclips.com, which allows me to put in the subject that I'm looking for. So you could put in perseverance or grit and see what video clips from famous movies come up for your use in your classroom, if YouTube is not working out for you. The last thing that I like to do is I like to use famous people, famous quotes to start the conversation with my students. So when you look at how some of our world leaders or some of our world innovators like Walt Disney started out being told that he wasn't going to be able to accomplish things and allow kids to see what he did accomplish because he persevered. Some of those stories and anecdotes speak so much and they take such a short amount of your class time just to start the conversation. The most important thing I want you to remember in terms of frustration in your classroom is that it should be welcomed by your students as well as yourself. So when we teach students that that is part of our learning process and it is embraced, then we can show them that perseverance is necessary and good for us. As we move into the coping strategies piece, I want you to think about the stressors that you have felt before personally. So your facilitator is going to give you a sheet that lists all of the common stressors people feel, and they fall into 4 categories. I'm going to ask you to put a little star to the left of the ones that you personally have felt before. Your facilitator will guide you in a conversation about which ones you have felt, and then what do you do to combat some of those stressors? So what are the coping strategies that you use to help with those? Take a few minutes to complete that activity. I'm hoping you had a good and lively discussion about the ways in which you cope with the stressors in your life. I know many people probably mentioned things such as exercise and talking with a friend, or my favorite, making that list that helps me get some of those worries off of my mind. I'm going to ask you to return now to that list of stressors and do a quick activity for me. All I'm going to ask you to do now is to the right of all of those stressors, put a star or put a check next to the ones that you think your students have felt. Which ones do you think your students are dealing with? And that should take no more than a minute. Thank you. All right, my friends, so you've looked through the list, and I'm guessing that most of your lists are pretty hefty. Our students are feeling a lot of those similar stressors that we feel as well. But I have a question for you, and that question is, how are they learning to deal with those stressors in their life? How did you learn those things that you used in order to cope with your stressors? For so many of us, it was just tried. I didn't like running, but I do like yoga. Making lists works great, listening to music doesn't work for me. So we really just tried things out until we hit it. The problem is our students don't necessarily always have that luxury of trying out things. And the things that they are trying out to deal with their stress are not necessarily healthy choices. So when we see a rise in behaviors of things like substance abuse and alcohol abuse and cutting and suicide, we are finding students that are looking for ways to cope with their stress that are not healthy ways. As educators then, it's upon us to try to give them some of the things that they could do to cope with the stress, the anxiety in their lives. I'm going to ask you to remember that for students, those stressors are 110% real for them. And even though they may not seem like a huge sort of stress for someone who's dealing with different kinds of stress, for them they are very real. It's important then for us to give them some of the strategies that we may use or that they can use at any time to deal with some of the stress in their life. Your facilitator is going to guide you through a series of breathing strategies for you to try out and see if you can use with your students. And we'll come back and talk about some other strategies that you may want to use in your classroom. Thank you for playing along with that. My favorite is the hot cocoa breathing because it works so well, especially with our youngest friends. I did want to show you some of the other strategies that you can use. Hopefully you did get to try bubble blowing, which you can buy at Party City in bulk. I also wanted to show you a mind jar that I use in my classroom, and these are made from glitter glue, glitter, and hot water. I do seal the top on, and I do recommend you make them out of the plastic water bottles instead of the glass like this one. But I always had two different mind jars in my classroom, one that settled in a shorter amount of time and one that settled in a longer amount of time. The more glitter glue you use, the slower they actually settle. Students always had an option upon greeting me if they needed a few minutes because they were agitated from something that happened in the hallway, in the cafeteria, on the bus, with a parent on their phone. They could take a few minutes to go sit in the corner, settle their mind, settle their thoughts, as you see this one, and then rejoin them and rejoin the classroom. At that moment, they were able to go from that limbic flare to that neocortex, and they were more apt to listen to the material and learn some content. Other things you can think about is that idea of coloring. Are students allowed to color in your classroom? I had many doodlers that I know would doodle, but they were always paying attention. It helps them focus. We may also be looking at teaching kids how to make lists. So if you're starting to feel stress, what kind of list could you make that would take some of that burden off for you? I know for my own son that suffered with anxiety, we learned to make lists as a way of making the list, locking it away, and letting go of it for a period of time. I then modeled that with my students as well for those that were higher anxiety in my classroom, especially before testing situations. I did things such as balancing peacock feathers with some students. So that rowdy group that comes back after lunch and is flying off the walls, and I need a few minutes to get them settled, I would put on light music, give them each a peacock feather, and have them just concentrate on balancing that feather for a little period of time. You could physically feel the room settle down. Things like yoga cards, balance balls, flexible seating arrangements, all of those work to helping kids learn what they need in order to modify their behavior, cope with their stressors. Hopefully you're teaching these strategies in such a way that they can transfer them to other classrooms. And I often had students say to me, well, I know there's no mind jar in Mr. So-and-so's class, but I can create one in my mind and see the pieces settle. The other thing I encourage you to really think about using in your classroom is some kind of journal. And I know many teachers use journaling for their content area, whether it be ELA or history. But I'm asking you to think about journaling in other ways as well, in terms of releasing some of our anxieties, talking about what we're worrying about, maybe making some connections between content and what I think about or what I know about from other things, and giving kids an outlet that includes some writing for those that are good at that piece. The important part of this entire thing is to really teach kids to start noticing when they're off course and a variety of ways that they can use to get themselves back on course. So teaching them those skills so that they can transfer them and use them no matter what situation they may be, lifelong. All right, my friends, we have made it through that strategy portion, and now I'm going to task you with taking it a step further. You are going to receive a template that actually focuses on those three categories of foundational skills, perseverance, and coping strategies. And what I'm going to ask is for you to write down 1 to 2 strategies, skills, practices that you are going to embed this year, whether they be daily or weekly or monthly, things that you are going to focus on in these 3 areas. Your facilitator will guide you through that activity, and hopefully you can share out with your colleagues, team up, come up with some great ideas to work with together. I'm excited for you to begin this journey of teaching kids how to manage their own behavior instead of us always trying to find ways to manage compliance. In order to do so, there's one last piece of closure you have to do for today's module. That is finishing this sentence. Self-management does not have to be the most challenging part of SEL because fill in that blank for your facilitator, and I look forward to hearing some of your responses. Thank you.